Bring me another, immediately.
Have you ever heard of a king who didn't die in battle, wasn't poisoned by his enemies, and didn't fall to disease, but instead was slowly murdered by his own fork, Henry VIII, once England's golden prince? 6'2", broad-shouldered, muscular. The very image of Renaissance perfection died as a rotten, wheezing, pus-leaking mountain of flesh. By the end, he weighed over 400 pounds, couldn't walk without mechanical help, and smelled so foul that courtiers stuffed perfumed cloths into their noses just to survive his presence. But this wasn't just about overeating. This was obsession, addiction, madness. He devoured whole peacocks, swans stuffed with birds, stuffed with more birds, and grotesque meat pies that looked like culinary monsters. His meals weren't eaten, they were performed like military campaigns. Trumpets, taste testers, fear of poison, roaring fires, an army of cooks who died from heat stroke just trying to keep up. By his final years, his body was collapsing in slow motion. His legs oozed blood and pus. His bed had ropes to haul him upright, and he ordered executions when servants tried to cut back his food. He hoarded meat like a starving peasant, while half of England went hungry to feed his hunger. When he died in January of the year 1547, his coffin burst open during the funeral, swollen with gases from a corpse that was already decomposing from within. Even in death, Henry could not stop consuming. This is not just a story about food. It is a historical horror about what happens when absolute power meets absolute indulgence. And it only gets worse from here. This is the first chapter in a 9-part descent, from athletic glory to psychological ruin, from roast swans to rotting legs, from throne to tomb. Are you ready to watch the king eat himself to death?
You there! Fetch me another!
Once, before the ulcers, before the fevered weight, before the fear that clung to every dish of meat, Henry was young, radiant, and radiant in ways no one had yet seen from an English king. He was not born to inherit the throne that honour belonged to his older brother Arthur, who died before destiny could take root. And so when Henry ascended in the year 1509, at the age of 18, England gained not only a monarch, but a vision of power wrapped in flesh and confidence. He stood tall, nearly 6 feet and 2 inches, lean yet muscular, with auburn hair that gleamed like polished copper in sunlight, and a posture so upright it seemed carved from ambition itself. In those early years, Henry did not shuffle through corridors, bloated and breathless. He danced. He hunted. He jousted beneath banners that caught the wind like prophecy. The court sang of his beauty. Women swooned. Poets compared his physique to that of Apollo. And the kingdom, still licking wounds from dynastic war, began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, this golden boy might be a golden age. But behind every golden facade, there is a shadow that grows with time. And for Henry, that shadow was food. In those first years, his appetite was not yet grotesque, not yet monstrous, but there was a strange intensity to the way he consumed his meals. While other noblemen dined with joy or casual routine, Henry attacked his food with the same fervour he brought to battlefields. He didn't just eat, he conquered. Meals were events, multi-course declarations of dominance, curated performances to remind all who watched that he was not just king by title, but by appetite. The kitchens of Hampton Court were transformed from culinary spaces into something resembling war zones. 200 staff worked in brutal shifts, sweating before open flames that devoured 6 to 8 tons of oak wood each day, fueling fires large enough to roast entire oxen. And when the fires cooled, they roasted again. Lambs, deer, boars, pigeons, geese, calves, and pigs disappeared into ovens and returned as offerings to the monarch's seemingly bottomless stomach. And yet, for a time, Henry's body could handle it. He was young, and the gods of youth are often forgiving. He could down tankards of ale and still mount a steed by afternoon. He could eat a whole pie stuffed with smaller pies and still waltz until the stars retreated from the sky. The weight came, yes, but slowly, stealthily, hidden beneath layers of silken armor, behind the glow of his smile and the sparkle in his eyes. No one dared question the king's diet, not when he still radiated the vigor of a lion pacing its territory. And so the meals grew longer, the plates grew fuller, the recipes grew stranger. Birds were stuffed within birds, pigs were sewn shut with chickens in their bellies, fish were baked to resemble snakes, and entire animals were posed in battle stances, coated in gold leaf or edible jewels, as if to remind diners that nature itself bowed to the king's appetite. Still, the man inside the monarch was changing, even if the courtiers could not yet see it. There were moments, quiet ones, private ones, when Henry would eat alone, without ceremony or witnesses, and devour food with a desperation that resembled fear. He began hoarding meats in his chambers, hiding loaves under cushions and barrels of sweet wine behind tapestries, as if preparing for siege or famine. It was strange behavior for a man whose kingdom bent over backward to feed him. But no one spoke of it. Not yet. Not when his voice still boomed across the council chambers. Not when he still bore sons in his dreams and believed himself destined to reshape all of Christendom. The first true sign that something was unraveling came not in the form of flesh, but of fear. Henry grew obsessed with poisoning. He began to distrust the food placed before him. Tasting rituals became more elaborate. Dishes were sampled not once, but 3 times. Plates were carried in sealed containers, unlocked only before his eyes. Cooks were replaced with others, sworn by blood and oath. Some say he even ordered silverware tested with strange powders and stones from the East, designed to blacken upon contact with venom. Whether these rituals protected him or simply fed his paranoia is unknown. But the psychological transformation had begun. What had once been a king's dinner was now a battlefield of suspicion and survival. And still he ate. He always ate. By his mid-20s, his figure had begun to thicken. His doublet no longer hugged his torso, it strained. His cheeks, once defined, began to swell. His gait grew slower, heavier. He continued to hunt. But now he preferred to shoot rather than chase. He continued to dance, but shorter, slower. Some courtiers whispered of king's weight, an inevitable softening they had seen in other rulers. But Henry was not like other kings. He was an eater of symbols, a consumer of power, and to him, a growing belly meant a growing throne. He ordered new chairs, new beds, new garments. Doorways were widened, horses groaned beneath his saddles, and still no one dared say the word gluttony, because gluttony was a sin, and kings did not sin. They hungered. It was not just the body that changed, it was the rhythm of court life itself. Meals stretched from hours into days. Diplomats waited while Henry chewed. Negotiations paused between bites of swan and beef. Important treaties were signed with Greece still staining his fingers. Foreign envoys returned home with tales of excess, so obscene they sounded fictional. But the letters survived, and the stories endure of meat torn with bare hands, to of wine spilled down royal chins, to of groaning tables that collapsed under their own offerings. And yet no one stopped him. For how do you deny a king his cravings? How do you tell a man chosen by God that his mouth has become a weapon, that his plate is a grave? You do not. You nod. You serve. You look away when he demands more. By the end of his 20s, the once golden prince was no longer golden. But the real horror The true transformation had only just begun. In the deep belly of Hampton Court Palace, the fires never slept. They raged day and night, like furnaces fed by the king's will, consuming whole forests of oak just to roast the endless parade of beasts destined for one man's table. The smoke climbed the walls like incense, offered to an insatiable god, and the kitchen bricks glowed so hot they could singe the flesh of a careless hand from 3 feet away. 200 cooks laboured in silence beneath the vaulted ceilings, their faces glistening with sweat, their sleeves darkened by blood and grease, their lungs clogged with the heavy perfume of roasted meat and smoke. They did not prepare meals. They prepared sacrifices. Each day was a ritual of butchery and fire, and each flame fed a hunger that no man could tame. Henry's appetite, once merely large, had grown into something monstrous. It was no longer about taste or celebration. It had become a rhythm, a compulsion, a clock by which the entire palace now ticked. Morning began not with prayer or counsel, but with what he called his first feast, a roasted chicken, a joint of beef, 3 meat pies, and a basket of warm bread drenched in honey and butter, all washed down with ale poured by trembling hands. Mid-morning brought another meal, no less extravagant, followed by a lunch that stretched into evening, and then dinner that could last until the candles melted to wax puddles beneath silver candelabras. In between these meals were smaller indulgences, light refreshments by his definition. A roasted pheasant here, a flagon of wine there, an entire wheel of cheese devoured absent-mindedly, while discussing taxes or war. There was no longer a beginning or end to his eating. There was only consumption, a steady tide of food rising and falling with the hours. What made it worse, what turned curiosity into horror, was not just the quantity, but the style. Henry no longer dined in quiet pleasure. He performed his meals like a grotesque theatre. The table was set with mathematical precision, dozens of dishes placed in symmetrical rows, each course announced like the arrival of a conquering army, and Henry sat like a general surveying a battlefield, choosing which dish would fall first beneath his hands. He tore into meat with his fingers,
Bring me another.
fat
immediately.
running down his arms, his breath heavy between bites, his eyes wild with a hunger that seemed to have detached itself from human restraint. He spoke through mouthfuls of food, sometimes of trivial things, sometimes of war or death or prophecy, and the sound of his chewing became the background music of his reign, wet, animalistic, endless. At court, few dared to comment. Instead, they adapted. Ministers arranged affairs of state around his digestion. Foreign ambassadors adjusted their schedules to accommodate his feasts. Tapestries were perfumed with lavender and cloves to mask the stench of meat and sweat that clung to the throne room. Courtiers learned to keep their expressions still, even as the king's spit flew during diplomatic meetings, even as bones were hurled to the floor and dogs were summoned to lick the marble clean. Some vomited in secret chambers. Others drank more wine to numb their revulsion. But none dared say aloud what they all knew, that the king was being consumed by his own hunger, and no one could stop it. Behind the scenes, the fires burned hotter. The royal kitchens had become a place of suffering. Workers collapsed from exhaustion, overcome by the heat, their bodies dragged away and replaced within minutes. Floors slick with grease became death traps. Burn wounds and sliced fingers were common. Some whispered that the kitchens were cursed, that the ceaseless demand for food had turned the space into a kind of hell, a furnace not just of meat, but of souls. The fires, some said, were no longer just for cooking. They were for feeding something far darker. Still, Henry ordered more. He demanded new dishes, new spectacles. He asked his cooks to invent. They responded with culinary creations that defied nature. Entire pigs stuffed with ducks, which were stuffed with chickens, which in turn were stuffed with sparrows. These abominations were sewn shut, roasted whole, then encased in pastry armor, so thick it required knives forged for battle to pierce. The king applauded these creations. He roared with joy at their unveiling, clapped grease-covered hands, and rewarded his cooks with gold, and also sometimes with beheadings. When the presentation displeased him, there was no reasoning with him anymore. As his body expanded, so did his cruelty. His mood swings became sharper, more unpredictable. When food arrived late, or too cold, or not in the precise shape he imagined, servants were slapped, imprisoned, or worse, rumors spread of a boy barely 15 who was caught licking gravy from a plate before it reached the king. He was hanged. Another man was executed for stealing royal scraps. Henry declared that food meant for him was sacred. To touch it without permission was treason. This obsession, this sacred hunger, was no longer just a personal habit. It was a doctrine, a belief system enforced with violence, and in its name, the court obeyed. Always. And yet, the king's body began to betray him. By the age of 30, the weight had become more than symbolic. It was literal. His joints ached. His breath grew labored. His legs, once praised across Europe for their strength and beauty, began to swell and darken. Physicians noticed signs of something deeper, something wrong beneath the skin. And though they dared not name it aloud, they saw the future coming like a slow-burning fire. Because fire, after all, is what started it. The fire in the kitchens, the fire of appetite, the fire of power, and fire, if left unchecked, consumes all. It began with the legs, those same legs that once galloped through royal forests, that danced beneath glittering chandeliers, that stood proud upon marble floors as treaties were signed and oaths were sworn. Those very legs began to die, while still attached to the living body of a king. No wound marked the start. No sudden scream or spill of blood. It was slower than that. Quieter. It started as stiffness, then became swelling, then warmth, then pain. And the pain, once ignorable, grew persistent, pressing, seething beneath the surface like something buried and alive. The physicians, summoned in whispers, unwrapped the royal stockings with trembling hands and found what they feared: ulcers, wet and black around the edges, oozing fluid that stained the bandages yellow before they even touched flesh. The smell hit first foul, sweet, unmistakably rotten. The royal body, still seated upon the throne, had begun to decay from the ground up, but no one dared speak the truth. Instead, they bled him. They bathed him in wine. They applied poultices of herbs and heated stones. They whispered prayers over his bandaged limbs and applied ointments with names older than the crown itself. But nothing worked. The ulcers grew deeper. The skin split wider. The pus became thicker. The blood darker. Every morning, a trail of stain marked the path from Henry's chamber to his chair. Not the red of royal robes, but the leaking rot of a body slowly surrendering to itself. And yet he continued to eat. The worse his body became, the more he consumed. He grew louder at the table, more aggressive. He tore into meat with a fury that frightened even seasoned guards. His hunger, now visibly detached from his body's ability to process it, seemed driven not by the stomach, but by something deeper, something spiritual, even demonic. In its persistence, courtiers began to speak of it in whispers, calling it the Black Appetite. Some believed he was cursed. Others believed he had simply gone mad. The truth was more disturbing. He was both. Sleep became rare. The pain in his legs would not let him lie flat. He slept sitting upright, supported by pillows, surrounded by the scent of his own infection. Even in his dreams, he reached for food. Servants reported him sleep-talking about meat, wine, gravy, and pies. Sometimes they awoke to find him sitting in the dark, chewing air, his mouth moving around an invisible meal. The throne room changed. Once a place of reverence, it became a place of avoidance. Courtiers angled themselves to remain upwind of the king. Ministers shortened audiences. Even jesters, once free to provoke and poke, fell silent in his presence. The rot from his legs now seemed to fill the air, not only with stench, but with something heavier dread. No one wanted to breathe the same air as the king. Yet all were bound to him. He ordered his chairs reinforced, not for grandeur, but necessity. The weight of his body had become so immense that ordinary thrones cracked beneath him. Iron was built into the frames. Ramps were constructed throughout the palace to accommodate his growing immobility. Doorways were widened, steps removed. What was once a castle became a cage, a soft prison tailored to one man's size. Beneath the palace, the kitchens continued their work. The fires burned. The animals died. The blood flowed. But even there, the mood had changed. Servants began referring to the king not by name, but by code, the furnace. They called him the endless plate, his consuming maester. None dared say these names aloud within the halls. But behind doors, they feared him not for his laws, not for his executions, but for what he had become, a man who ate in defiance of his own death. And still, the legs rotted. The physicians tried everything. Leeches, mercury, heated knives. They even considered amputation. But none could find the courage to propose it. Cutting the king's legs, they reasoned, might kill him, or worse, might anger him. And an angry king, even one who could barely walk, was still a king. So they let the wounds fester. They changed his bandages daily. They burned scented oils nearby. They lied, saying he looked improved. Meanwhile, the pus spread beneath the flesh like roots of some buried evil. At times, Henry would ask to see the damage. He would stare down at his legs, his mouth twitching in something between rage and disbelief. These were not the legs, he remembered, not the legs of the golden boy from decades past. These were the limbs of a corpse. But then he would call for food. He would demand a roasted goose, or venison pie, or sugared bread. As if meat could undo mortality. As if flesh could repair flesh. By now, even his horses struggled to bear his weight. Hunting was impossible. Dancing unthinkable. He ruled from his chair. Holding court between bites, his breathing laboured, his voice deeper and slower, his hands swollen like overfilled gloves. And as the court watched, helpless and nauseated, one truth settled over them all like a slow, suffocating fog. The king was dying, but he would not stop. He would not stop eating. He would not stop rotting. He would not stop ruling. Not until something greater than appetite claimed him. But for now the rot beneath the throne spread. By the time the king reached his 40s, there was no longer any illusion left, not in the mirrors, not in the court, not even in the blood-soaked bandages that trailed behind him like the remnants of a decaying robe. The man once hailed as the embodiment of chivalry had become a ruin seated on a throne, a monarch, not of England, but of indulgence itself. His power, once built on charisma and command, now sustained itself through fear, a bit, and ritual. The court no longer gathered around him for wisdom or war. They circled him like crows around carrion, watching, waiting, pretending they did not smell what they smelled or see what they saw. The crown, heavy with rubies and dust, no longer sat comfortably on his brow. His face had ballooned into a swollen landscape of flesh, where once sharp cheekbones had given definition and pride. His neck disappeared entirely, so that his head appeared to rest directly upon his shoulders, like a wax figure melting into itself. His hands, once skilled with sword and quill, could barely grip a goblet without tremor, and yet those same hands tore into roasted beasts with the fury of a man half-starved. A contradiction that haunted everyone who watched. It was as if the hunger had taken control not of the belly, but of the throne. Meals, once social ceremonies, had become grotesque parades of denial. No one could finish a plate in the king's presence without struggling to suppress their revulsion. For the sound of Henry's eating was its own nightmare. He no longer chewed quietly. He slurped, chomped, moaned, his breath heavy, his mouth slick, his face dripping with grease and wine as he demanded more, always more. The sounds filled the dining hall and echoed down the marble corridors, a grim symphony of decay disguised as dinner. Foreign ambassadors, who once sought his favor, now sought early exits. Some wrote home that the English king had become a monster of appetite, no longer fit to rule or even be seen. Behind closed doors, servants wept, not for pity, but from exhaustion and despair. Feeding the king had become a military operation. Special chairs were constructed with wheels and restraints, designed not to transport him with dignity, but to keep him upright during his eating frenzies. Teams of footmen pushed him from chamber to chamber like pallbearers, carrying a body that refused to die. Ramps were laid across the palace like arteries feeding a diseased heart, and guards were posted not to protect him from enemies, but to guard the food. For the king had become so paranoid that he ordered executions for anyone caught touching his rations without permission. He no longer trusted even his own kitchen. He believed poison lingered in every dish, that his enemies crept in the steam, rising from his stew, that the ghosts of those he had wronged whispered threats through the hiss of the fire. Every bite required tasting by multiple men. Every plate was tested with stones, herbs, and powders. But even this wasn't enough. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Henry would wake in a cold sweat and demand to see his larders. He would shuffle through them like a dragon inspecting its hoard, counting loaves, sniffing meat, demanding to know why a pheasant was missing or a pie had grown cold. Servants began to fear the sound of his breath, in the darkness more than any sword. And yet, through it all, he ruled, even as his body collapsed in slow motion, even as his mind fragmented under the weight of suspicion and excess. The kingdom continued to bow. He signed laws with a shaking hand. He approved executions with food still clinging to his beard. He declared wars between mouthfuls. And though he had once changed the very Church of England with boldness and vision, now he changed only his waistcoats wider, looser, lined with fragrant herbs to mask the seeping stench of dying flesh. His wives suffered quietly. One wept openly at their wedding feast as she watched him devour an entire swan. Her dreams of romance dissolved in meat, grease, and silence. Another fainted upon seeing him for the first time, unable to reconcile the painted portraits with the bloated reality seated before her. The last, the most devout, spent her nights not in his arms, but in prayer, not for his recovery, but for deliverance from the horror of watching a man devour himself to death. Course by course, day by day, outside the palace walls, the people suffered too, as Henry consumed more. The court demanded more. Farmers were forced to surrender livestock for royal tribute. Forests were cleared to fuel the kitchen fires. Markets were emptied to supply royal feasts. And while the king ate his third dinner, children in the countryside starved. Rumors spread through villages that the king was cursed, that he had become a beast, that he drank blood, that he was not king at all anymore, but some shadow wearing a crown, hungry not just for food, but for the land, for the people, for the very soul of England. And perhaps they were not wrong, because the crown no longer rested upon a man. It rested upon a hunger that no longer knew when to stop, a hunger that spoke through royal decrees and bled through bandages and slept in a chair too large for any human frame, a hunger that had once worn golden armor and sung Latin hymns and danced until dawn, a hunger that had once loved and laughed and believed in God. Now, it devoured everything it touched, and it was still not full. By the time the winter of Henry's life settled across England, there was no longer any question of when the king might recover. The physicians no longer spoke of improvement. The courtiers no longer whispered of remedies. The cooks no longer prepared food for celebration, only for delay, for distraction. And within the bedchamber, once filled with laughter and lute songs, now hovered only the sound of coughing, the slow creak of swollen limbs shifting under their own weight, and the wet, sticky murmur of ulcers weeping into linens. The bed itself had been transformed from a place of rest into a mechanical device of survival. Ropes were suspended from the canopy, not for elegance, but for leverage to hoist the king upright like a puppet too bloated to move. Dozens of cushions were arranged nightly around his torso to prevent him from rolling onto his back. For when he did, he would stop breathing. His chest, pressed by his own bulk, could no longer lift properly without assistance, and sleep became a nightly gamble with death. When he did drift off, it was never for long. His breath would hitch. Dinhout and his chamberlains, trained now in silent panic, would rush to reposition him. He would wake cursing, sweating, confused, and always hungry. This bed, so wide it dwarfed even the largest of men, had once been built for passion, for heirs, for the union of queens and kings beneath silken drapery embroidered with Tudor roses. Now it was soaked in blood and wine and the bitter tang of rot. Servants changed the sheets daily, sometimes twice, sometimes more, yet the smell never lifted. The ulcers on his legs had deepened into caverns of exposed tissue and bone. Some were so wide a man's fist could vanish inside them. Physicians applied poultices of honey, of rosewater, of burned linen ash and oils from the east, but the wounds did not close. They breathed, they festered, they spread, and still he refused to acknowledge the truth. He called for his feasts from this bed. He held counsel from this bed. He dictated laws from this bed. He planned battles, executions, alliances, and marriages from this bed. The king had once ruled from horseback, from cathedral, from throne. Now he ruled from a mattress soaked in disease, surrounded by sweating physicians and weeping furniture, and the bed, like the man upon it, had begun to groan beneath the weight of both flesh and denial. Food continued to arrive in waves, day and night, even as the king struggled to remain conscious. Trays arrived, bearing roasted capons, glazed hams, spiced cakes, puddings soaked in wine, flagons of ale, and flasks of imported sweet liquors. Servants were rotated hourly to keep pace. Some carried food, others dabbed the king's brow, others swatted away flies that congregated around his wounds. A select few managed the smells bowls of burning herbs, scented cloths, and rose petals scattered along the floor. Though none of it was enough. The scent of rotting human flesh was not something perfume could overcome. At night, the hallucinations came. He would speak to ghosts. He called for Anne Boleyn, for Jane Seymour, for his brother Arthur, for his father, for Wolsey, for Cromwell, for God, for sons he had buried and daughters he had rejected. Sometimes he thought the bed was a ship and ordered it to sail. Other times, he believed it was a tomb and cried out to be rescued from the stone that pressed against his chest. He forgot which day it was, sometimes which year. He forgot which queen lay beside him, and eventually, there was no queen, just silence, and the ceaseless murmur of dying meat. The crown remained at the foot of the bed, untouched, unpolished, a silent relic of a reign that had outlived its body. No one dared remove it. No one dared place it. It sat as if waiting, Not for a head, but for a moment when the man who once wore it would finally close his eyes and let go of the feasts. The fires, the fury, and the fear, but Henry, even in the face of death, could not let go. He had become too entangled with his appetites. Food was no longer fuel. It was religion. It was resistance. It was the one constant in a world of betrayal and decay. He demanded his meals with the same voice he once used to command armies, and when food was delayed, even by minutes, he screamed, not with the voice of a dying man, but with the rage of a king who still believed the world revolved around the gravity of his hunger. By now, physicians had abandoned subtlety. They spoke of organ failure in hushed tones. His heart, they said, beat too slowly, 1 hour. Too rapidly the next. His liver, hardened by decades of wine and overindulgence, had yellowed his skin to a corpse-like pallor. His breath rattled with every inhale. His eyes no longer opened fully. And when they did, they stared into space, as if the man inside had retreated far from the bed, far from the kingdom, into a place where meat never cooled and time never passed. One morning, after an especially long night of vomiting, sleepwalking, and ranting about stolen food, the king fell asleep, mid-sentence, a chunk of meat still resting on his chest. Untouched. He did not stir for hours. Servants waited, prayed, and listened, but he breathed. He always breathed. That was the tragedy of Henry. He would not stop breathing, even when the rest of him had already died. And so, the bed remained. The tomb, without a lid, a place where kings ate their way into legend, where power decayed beneath silk, and where even death itself waited not patiently, but with revulsion, because something had already died in that room. Something had died long before the body. A soul, perhaps, or a nation's memory of glory, or the last flicker of the man once known as England's Golden Prince. But not the hunger, never the hunger. By the time the calendar turned to the year 1547, those who remained at court moved with a kind of reverent dread, as if every footstep, every whispered word, every plate laid upon silver trays might be the one that finally ended the long, gluttonous reign of a king who refused to die. Henry's body, so swollen now that it strained the limits of architecture and furniture alike, had become a monument to resistance, not of will or valor, but of something deeper, darker, the primitive refusal of flesh to release power. He had stopped ruling months ago in any meaningful sense. Ministers signed documents in his name. Ambassadors were dismissed without audiences. Battles were prepared without his voice. And yet the country did not crown another, because the king somehow still breathed. His bed, reinforced with iron beneath velvet, groaned each time his chest heaved. The rot in his legs had reached the bone. Surgeons, their hands trembling beneath layers of perfumes and oils, attempted to clean the wounds but found that even steel blades recoiled. The ulcers now pulsed and glistened like the eyes of buried animals weeping fluid that soaked the floors. The sheets, the tapestries. There were days when the stench leaked through the palace walls, through corridors once filled with song, now haunted only by servants pressing rosemary to their lips and pleading for reassignment. But no one left, because everyone knew the truth. The end was coming. They just did not know when. What made it worse, what turned a slow death into a spectacle of divine absurdity, was that Henry kept eating, no longer 3 meals, no longer 5. Now, food was brought every hour. There was no schedule, no restraint. He demanded food while unconscious. He spoke of pork in his sleep. He mumbled about pies between gasps for breath. And when he could not raise his arms, servants fed him slowly, carefully, as if he were a dying god whose worship depended on being kept full. Even as his skin split open beneath the pressure, no longer able to chew large cuts of meat. They carved soft portions for him, boiled hens, sugared custards, liquefied fruit and beef reduced to paste. It no longer mattered what it tasted like. He could barely speak, but he could swallow. And he did. He swallowed like a man possessed. And perhaps he was, in those final days, something had taken over. His eyes, bloodshot and small now, in a face swollen beyond recognition, stared not at people but at things only. He could see feasts no one else had prepared. Banquet longtemps passed. Queens already buried. Children never born. He spoke to them. He argued with ghosts. He made toasts to shadows. He threatened enemies who no longer lived. And in moments of clarity, he demanded even more food. Not because he hungered, but because it was all he had left. His body, however, had long since surrendered. His heart enlarged to twice its normal size, beat not like a drum, but like a war machine cracking apart. His liver had failed. His lungs collapsed under the weight of his chest. His breath came in ragged sobs, short and shallow, each one more desperate than the last. His skin, once pâle, then pink, had turned a shade of yellowish grey. At times, it seemed as though he were decomposing while still alive. And still the food came. Still the king lived. The physicians, bound by loyalty and fear, continued their rituals, bleeding, binding, whispering Latin prayers, applying ointments that had no effect. Some wept behind closed doors. Others begged to be reassigned. A few collapsed from the smell alone. The court, once a place of pageantry, had become a mausoleum of denial. And in its center sat the bloated corpse of a man still technically breathing, and still technically king. Even Catherine Parr, his final queen, kept her distance now. She did not sleep in the same room. She barely spoke above a whisper. She had come into this marriage with a heart full of service, and now she served only through silence. Behind chapel doors, she prayed, not for her husband's healing, but for mercy, not for his soul, but for the peace that would follow when the crown finally fell. And yet day after day, the crown remained. It sat untouched, unworn, glinting like an accusation. Every sunrise that passed without his death became more surreal, more unholy. It was as if time itself had grown weary. As if death, who had once walked alongside Henry in his battles, in his marriages, in his trials and triumphs, now waited just outside the door, unwilling to cross the threshold. Or perhaps death had entered already, but even he, overwhelmed by the stench and the spectacle, had stepped back in horror. And still the king breathed. He no longer asked for roast goose. Now it was roasted air. He hallucinated dishes that did not exist. He described flavors that had not been tasted in decades. He once spent half a day speaking to an empty plate, as if it were a rival. Then he wept when it did not answer. These were not merely symptoms of decline. They were the marks of a man who could not leave. Not because he was afraid of death, but because he had built his entire kingdom around appetite. And now that he had nothing left to eat, not even himself, he could not imagine where else to go. And so he lingered. The king who once moved armies with a glance now needed 6 men just to shift his body. The king who once bent churches to his will now could not lift his own crown. The king who had devoured wives and lands and dignity now devoured only silence. And even that noisily, because even in his final breathless hours, he refused to die. And that refusal echoed across the palace like a final decree. There was no trumpet, no prophecy, no angel descending from the rafters when it happened, no final feast, no whispered confession, no redemption. When death came for Henry VIII, and at last, it truly did. It came not as a storm, but as a whimper, cloaked in the linen silence of a palace too tired to mourn and too terrified to exhale. It was the 28th day of January. In the year 1547, the candlelight in his chamber burned low, the scent of herbs clashing with the stench of decomposition, and the once golden prince, now reduced to an immovable mountain of rotting flesh, let out a final, rattling breath. But even that breath, even that moment, refused to be simple. Some say he died with a grunt. Others claim he muttered for roasted meat. A phantom request from a man who had once consumed birds, stuffed with birds, stuffed with birds. Who had once believed that swallowing kingdoms could save his soul. What they all agreed on was this. His eyes remained open, glassy, vacant, locked not on the cross above his bed, not on the physician at his side, not on the wife who no longer sat near him, but on something far beyond the walls of the palace, perhaps a vision of the feasts he would never taste, or the sins he had never acknowledged, or the silence that, for the first time in decades, had no scent of gravy. His body, however, would not let go easily. Death, it turned out, was not the end of suffering, not when the suffering had been self-inflicted. Course by course, decade after decade, his corpse, still bloated with undigested meat, wine, and decay, began to rupture within hours. The gases that had accumulated from the rot beneath his skin built like thunder in a sealed vault, and as the palace prepared for his state funeral, the unthinkable occurred. The coffin burst. Witnesses would later swear that the lid cracked with a sound like splitting wood, that the stench flooded the corridor like a curse, that a pool of black liquid seeped out from the base and soaked the floor where guards had once stood in formation. Some said it was an omen. Others said it was justice. None denied what they saw. The king had not just died. He had spoiled. It took 8 men to lift the coffin. The floorboards of Hampton Court had already been reinforced to hold his weight, but still groaned in protest as his body passed. The funeral procession moved not in reverence, but in dread. Priests gagged behind censers. Courtiers held scented cloths to their faces as they wept with one eye open. Somewhere, buried in the ceremony, that was the memory of what he once had been. The towering boy of 18 who danced and fought and sang Latin hymns. But that memory was now a ghost, erased by the meat, the wine, the greed, and the insatiable mouth that had replaced the man. An autopsy was ordered, though done in secret. The results, hidden in dusty archives and whispered among the learned, were so grotesque they read more like the dissection of a creature than a king. His liver, hardened and discoloured, bore the marks of decades of wine. His heart had doubled in size, not out of love or grief, but from straining under the burden of excess. His stomach, when opened, still held partially digested meat, his final meal, a banquet swallowed in his final hours. His legs, so rotted they had fused to the sheets, revealed infection that had travelled into the bone, and the wounds, those weeping craters on his lower limbs, had never closed. They had become highways for death to enter slowly, patiently, triumphantly, but perhaps most chilling of all, his mouth, still open, still parted, as if mid-bite, still hungering. It was this image, more than the autopsy, more than the collapsed coffin, more than the economic ruin or the stinking throne room, that haunted those who served him. The idea that he had died wanting more, not out of need, but out of habit. That his final act, even in death, had been to consume, and so history recoiled. The portraits stopped. The painters who once captured him with flattery now turned their brushes toward other kings. Slimmer kings. Cleaner kings. The priests spoke vaguely of his soul. The people, though still loyal to the crown, whispered their stories in taverns and alleys, tales of a monarch who became a monster, of a bed that smelled like death, of a feast that never ended. And the kitchens, once the fire-breathing heart of the palace, were finally allowed to cool. For the first time in decades, the ovens went dark, the knives were sheathed, the smoke cleared, England exhaled, and yet even now he lingers, not in flesh, that is long gone, reduced to bone and ash, not in glory, for his legacy was stained with blood and gravy both, but in memory, in the whispers that echo through castle walls, in the kitchens where the fires still remember, in the empty plates on royal tables, in the silence between state banquets. Because how do you bury a man who spent his life resisting the grave? You cannot. You wrap him in linen. You lower him into earth. You pray. And you hope that death, unlike history, does not look back. So here we are, at the quiet end of a story that was never truly quiet. A story filled with drums and meat and fire and rot. A story of a man who began his life as a prince of promise, tall, radiant, bursting with intellect and ambition, and ended as something else entirely. A husk, a myth, a cautionary tale. The echoes of his feasts have long since faded. The fires that once roared for his appetite are cold now, and the halls where he reigned have been scrubbed and repainted and redecorated a dozen monarchs since. But the memory of Henry, not the king, but the hunger remains. And perhaps that is what we must wrestle with, as we draw the blanket of night over this tale. Because Henry VIII did not die suddenly, he died every day, piece by piece, swallowed by his own hand. He dined himself into stillness, one bite at a time, until he could no longer rise from bed, until even the breath inside him labored to escape. He ruled a kingdom, yes, but he could not rule his own craving. And what is a king, really, if not a servant to something greater, be it his people, his God, or, in Henry's case, his stomach? There was no great betrayal that undid him, no battlefield defeat, no poison in a jeweled goblet. What consumed him was what he consumed: roast fowl and wine and sweet pies, laced with denial. And the truth that haunted his dying breath was simple, tragic, and terribly human. He never knew when to stop. Even in death, he clung to food. His body refused peace. His flesh rebelled. His coffin cracked. His stomach held remnants of one last supper. It is not morbid to say this, it is meaningful, because in that image, a king bloated with the weight of his own desires, lies a reflection of us all. In smaller ways, quieter ways. Don't we all feed what should have been left behind? Don't we all, in some hidden corner of ourselves, carry the danger of wanting more than we need? Perhaps that's why Henry's story lingers. It isn't just about gluttony or royalty. It's about the ache of emptiness. The void we try to fill with things that were never meant to satisfy. Food, for Henry, became comfort, power, distraction, and religion.
Bring
He believed,
me another, immediately.
truly, that by eating enough, he could outrun death. That if he swallowed enough gold and goose and glory,
another.
he would never have to sit alone with silence. But death, of course, waits, and silence, always, finds a way in. Now, Century Later, we speak his name in history books and documentaries. We laugh at the paintings, the big eyes, the fat hands, the ridiculous chairs. But behind the portraits and the jokes is a very real man, lying in a very real bed, staring at the ceiling and begging for a pie he didn't need. A man who wore a crown but could not lift his own legs. A man so feared by his subjects, and so helpless against his own hunger. And so, as we close this story, perhaps we do not mock him. Perhaps, instead, we whisper a prayer, not for his body, long gone, but for the part of him that still walks with us, the part that forgets when to stop, the part that fears the silence, The part that eats to feel full, but is never fed. Sleep now. Henry, the fires have burned low. The tables are clear. The meat has grown cold. And the hunger that followed you across decades,
Vegetables.
across nations, across flesh and bone and shadow it too, at last, is quiet. You may rest now, and so may we.